There was a quiet kind of stillness in Daniel Hargrove's life, the kind that most people mistake for peace, but which is actually the silence that settles when things have stopped moving forward. His world had shrunk over the years. Once filled with movement, noise, ambition, and people, it had gradually collapsed inward until it was just him, a creaking house in a town forgotten by time, and the steady tick of a clock that felt more like a countdown than a comfort. He'd inherited the house after his uncle died, a man he barely remembered but was apparently the last living relative to claim it. It was tucked deep in a gray wooded corner of Maine, in a town called Wendlow. The place didn't even show up on most maps anymore. A few street signs, a diner, a post office that hadn't processed a letter in weeks. The kind of place where winter comes early and refuses to leave. Daniel didn't care. He didn't need much. He'd moved there 6 months ago, retreating from a life that had become unbearable in its weight. Failed relationships, a career that slipped through his fingers, friends who disappeared when he stopped being fun. Wendlow was a place to disappear, and Daniel had embraced that wholeheartedly. The house had character. That was the polite way of saying it was old, decaying, and groaned like a living thing when the wind picked up. He spent his days repairing it bit by bit, drinking too much coffee, and going for long walks that always ended with him standing at the edge of the forest that bordered the town, staring into the tangle of trees like they might whisper a secret if he waited long enough. It was on one of those walks that he found the shop. It hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. The street it stood on barely had 3 buildings: the diner, an abandoned barber's shop, and a grocery store that never changed its window display. But today, nestled between the boarded-up barber shop and the diner, stood a narrow doorway he could have sworn hadn't been there yesterday. The wood was dark, the glass dusty, and a crooked sign hung above the frame that read, "Curiosities." Inside, the air was thick with dust and something older, something musty. Shelves were crammed with strange things: a cracked porcelain doll with no eyes, brass instruments whose functions he couldn't guess, and stacks of books that seemed to sigh when he passed. An old man stood behind the counter, half shrouded in shadows. His eyes followed Daniel's every movement, but he said nothing. Daniel hadn't gone in looking for anything. He just wanted to look, but something near the back caught his attention. A candle. It was simple, nothing ornate. Black wax in a clear glass jar. No label, no scent, no price tag, but it pulled at him. He didn't remember picking it up, but suddenly it was in his hands. The wax was cold, but not in the way unlit wax should be. It was almost like touching stone, dry but wrong somehow. He turned to the man behind the counter, still silent, just a nod. He paid in cash, though he couldn't recall how much the man had said it cost. Maybe he hadn't said anything at all. Back home, the candle sat on his kitchen table. He stared at it longer than he meant to, unable to decide whether to light it or put it away. It didn't feel right, but it also didn't feel wrong, just peculiar. Later that evening, as the wind began to pick up and the trees outside tapped softly against the windows, Daniel struck a match and lit the wick. The flame came alive instantly, sharp and clear, tall for such a small candle, but something was off. He leaned in closer. There was no heat. He passed his hand slowly above the flame, expecting to feel the familiar warmth, but there was nothing, not even the faintest hint of heat. The flame danced normally, even brightened a little, as if reacting to the motion of his hand. But it was cold, cold in the way silence can be cold. He sat back frowning. It was possible, he reasoned, that it was a trick, maybe some sort of synthetic candle. But he'd seen the wick ignite. The wax was melting, and yet no heat. That night, he left the candle burning and sat in the chair across from it, watching the flame. It barely moved, just a soft, steady flicker. It cast shadows on the walls, long bending shapes that swayed with the flame's movement. He tried to read, but his eyes kept drifting back to the candle. It wasn't just that it gave off no warmth, it was something else, something that tugged at the back of his mind like a dream he couldn't quite remember. Eventually, he blew it out and went to bed. The next morning, the air in the kitchen smelled faintly of wax, but nothing else. The candle had burned clean, no smoke, no residue, just that odd cold wax. He lit it again, and again the flame danced without heat. Over the next few days, it became a ritual. Wake up, light the candle, sit in silence. He found comfort in the stillness it brought. The house seemed quieter when it was lit. The shadows seemed more obedient. It was as though the flame held something back, something waiting just outside the boundaries of the light. One night, after a particularly long walk through the woods, he returned to find the candle still burning on the table, exactly where he'd left it. Only this time, when he stepped into the room, the flame jumped. Not flickered, not danced. It jumped. A sudden, violent lurch, like something had startled it. Daniel froze. For a moment, he thought maybe a draft had come through, but the windows were shut. The air was still. The flame had steadied again, but its sudden reaction left a strange heaviness in his chest. He walked slowly to the table and sat down. The candle did not move again. The next morning, he tested it. He lit the candle, left the room, waited a few minutes, then walked back in. Again, the flame reacted. It whipped to one side as though caught in a gust of wind, and then calmed, as if acknowledging him. He tried again, left, waited, returned. Each time, the same reaction. There was no doubt now. The candle was aware of him. Something about that should have sent him running, but it didn't. If anything, it deepened his obsession. He began to treat the candle like a companion, lighting it in the morning, blowing it out before bed. Watching the flame became his only real task each day. He stopped going for walks, stopped eating full meals, stopped answering the phone. He stopped noticing the way the flame began to flicker more violently when he entered. Or maybe he noticed and simply chose to ignore it. Because the alternative, the thought that the flame was responding to him with more than just awareness, that it was trying to communicate, was something he wasn't ready to admit. But the candle had become the center of his world. He didn't understand it, but he needed it. And in the back of his mind, something whispered that the candle needed him too. The days began to blur. Daniel no longer marked time by clocks or calendars. Instead, he measured the hours by the candle's burn, the patterns in its flicker, and the shadows that stretched and curled along the walls as the flame danced in its cold silence. He kept a notebook beside it now, where he jotted down observations in a cramped, looping script that grew more erratic with each passing day. 10:12 a.m. Flame still, normal. 2:47 p.m. Entered room. Flame jumped left. No breeze. 5:19 p.m. Flame leaned sharply right, lingering motion for 14 seconds. The notebook filled quickly. Page after page of flame behavior, small details and sketches of how the shadows formed at different times. He stopped watching television, stopped listening to the radio. The phone stopped ringing. He hadn't noticed when it did. People in town had begun to talk about the man who never came out anymore, whose windows were always closed, who lit no lights at night except for one flickering glow seen from the kitchen. No one knocked. Windlow was not a town that asked questions. The candle was burning longer now. The wax should have run out by then, but it didn't. It melted in clean rings along the glass, forming a slick, mirror-like pool around the wick, but the level never truly dropped. He tried marking it with a piece of tape on the glass, each day expecting the line to be lower. It never changed. The flame became more active. It pulsed when he came near. It shuddered when he sat too long in silence. Sometimes it would sway violently for minutes, then go perfectly still the moment he looked away. He started to wonder if it liked being watched, or maybe it hated being ignored. More notes filled the margins of his pages. 6:02 a.m. Flame swirled counterclockwise for 10 seconds. My hand wasn't near. 3:11 p.m. Entered room, thinking of father. Flame lowered, almost went out. He tried experimenting, speaking to it. Never directly, never with questions. Just small comments about the weather, his memories, things he'd dreamed about. At first, the flame barely moved in response. But then, something shifted. He remembered the first time it happened. He had said something offhand while staring at the flame, something he hadn't even meant aloud. "I miss her." It had come out without thought, heavy in his throat, like a stone that had lived there for too long. He hadn't spoken her name in years. He didn't need to. The candle knew who he meant. The flame reared back, then curled in on itself, shrinking to a thin blue line that quivered. Then slowly it bloomed again, taller than before, bright and cold, casting a hard shadow that stretched across the wall behind him. He hadn't said anything after that. He didn't need to. From then on, the candle began reacting to more. Not just his presence, but his thoughts, feelings. He would feel a chill just before it stirred. He would think something dark, all hidden, and the flame would snap like a whip in response. It learned him. That's how he started to think of it. Not just that it was reacting, but that it was learning, understanding him, deepening its connection. There was intelligence behind that light, a quiet, ancient thing curled inside the flame like a sleeping animal that had begun to stir. It became harder to be away from it. He moved the candle with him from room to room, careful never to let the flame go out. The coldness of the wax meant it wouldn't warm the rooms, but somehow its presence was enough. It became a comfort even when it was violent, especially when it was violent. Daniel found himself drawn to its agitation as if the chaotic flickering were language, and he was getting closer to understanding what it said. At night, he dreamed of fire, not warm, golden fire, but cold, blue-white flame that slithered like liquid over black stone and bone. He saw towers of wax that stretched to the sky, melting in reverse, forming from nothing, rising with no origin. He walked through halls lit by candles that didn't flicker, but stared. In these dreams, he wasn't alone. He felt watched, not by people, but by presences, silent things that lined the walls like statues, each with a flame burning at its center. When he woke, the candle would be waiting, always burning, always cold. The flame had begun moving even when he was still. At first, he dismissed it as imagination. He'd be sitting at the table, lost in thought, and the candle would twitch, quick and sharp, without warning. No breeze, no movement, just a sudden jolt, as though it had heard something he hadn't. Sometimes it would sway for minutes at a time, pointing toward the far corner of the room where nothing sat but an old cupboard. Other times, it would spiral slowly, as if winding itself up before exploding into a frantic dance of motion. Once, he tried blowing it out. He hadn't meant to. Just a moment of fear, a pang of clarity. He stood, leaned over, and exhaled. The flame did not go out. It shrank for a second, shivered, and then flared brighter, taller. It bent toward him like an accusatory finger. He stumbled back, heart racing. From that day forward, he didn't try again. His notebooks grew darker, the handwriting more jagged. The observations now included lines that barely made sense to him. It knows the shape of my name, not a candle, a mirror, a gate. Flame speaks in memory. Flame eats time. I am not alone when it burns. He spoke less now, rarely even to himself. Words seemed to echo strangely in the room when the candle was lit. The air felt thick, not with smoke, but something heavier, something unseen. At times, he thought he could hear faint noises, soft clicks like fingernails on wood, or a hush like breath drawn through teeth. One night, as he sat watching the flame swirl, he became aware of movement behind him. He turned quickly. Nothing. The flame jerked. He turned back. Again, nothing. But then slowly, he began to notice it more often, just at the edge of his vision. A shape, a shadow that didn't belong to anything, too tall, too narrow. It stood just beyond the candlelight, perfectly still. When he turned to face it, it vanished, but the flame always reacted. Eventually, he stopped looking. Let it be. Whatever it was, it came with the candle. He began to speak to it, not like before, not casual remarks or thoughts said aloud. These were intentional. Words formed slowly, spoken carefully. He didn't expect answers, but he wanted them. He told the candle things he'd never said aloud, secrets buried so deeply he didn't know if they were real. He talked about his father's silence, his mother's disappearance, the way he used to wake up as a child, convinced something was watching him from the closet. He told it about Elise, about the way her laughter used to echo in the old apartment, about the way she stopped looking at him before she left, about the silence that followed. The candle listened. Sometimes the flame would slow, shrinking to a low, eerie flicker as he spoke. Other times it would erupt into violent, twisting motions, especially when he spoke of guilt. The more he confessed, the more the flame moved, not randomly, but with intention, as if it were responding. One night, he asked it a question. He didn't know why. He just did. What are you? The moment the words left his mouth, the flame stilled. Dead still. Not a flicker, not a twitch. For nearly a full minute, it remained frozen. Daniel held his breath. Then, slowly, it began to move again. A slow, curling motion that bent the flame toward him. Tip pointed directly at his chest. He felt a sudden chill wash over his skin. It was the first time he considered that the candle was not reacting to him. It was studying him. He started leaving the candle in different rooms to test its reactions. He placed it on the mantel in the living room, on the edge of the bathtub, by the foot of his bed. Each time, the flame behaved differently, subtly, but noticeably. The energy in the room would change. Sometimes the shadows would deepen, Sometimes they'd vanish completely. He began noticing strange patterns in the walls, lines that hadn't been there before, faint, almost like cracks, but too symmetrical, shapes forming in the ceiling, symbols he couldn't understand. When he looked away and back again, they were gone, but the candle always pointed at them before he saw. He started to draw them, dozens of them, his notebooks filled with these crooked symbols, circles with teeth, spirals with broken centers, shapes that made his vision blur if he stared too long. And all the while the candle burned, he hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, the dreams returned, darker now, louder. The flames in his dreams screamed without sound, and the statues wept wax that burned holes in the ground. He saw himself reflected in 1,000 mirrors, each face twisted in a different expression: grief, rage, ecstasy, terror, and behind every mirror, a flame, burning, watching. One morning he awoke with wax on his hands. It clung to his skin like dried blood, thick, cold. He rushed to the kitchen, but the candle was still on the table, unspilled, flame steady. He scraped the wax off in the sink, heart pounding. After that, the boundary between dream and waking began to break down. He found symbols scratched into his walls he didn't remember carving. His reflection lingered in mirrors after he moved away. His shadow split in two one evening, and the second shape didn't follow his movements. The candle's flame never changed, always cold, always watching. It was no longer a flame, it was an eye. Or perhaps it had always been, watching, waiting, learning, and Daniel was no longer sure who he was without it. The storm began just after midnight. The wind clawed at the windows, howling like something with lungs and hunger, and the trees groaned beneath a pressure that felt more than natural. The whole house seemed to shrink, bones creaking as if recoiling from something unseen. Rain hadn't yet fallen, but the sky churned, black and full, like it was holding its breath. Daniel sat at the table, eyes hollow, beard unkempt, skin pale. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't slept in 3. The candle sat before him as it always had, unwavering, its flame tall and thin as a blade. The light it cast was different now, not golden, not even orange, but white, almost silver, and impossibly sharp. It made everything in the room appear flattened, desaturated, like a photograph stripped of color. There was no heat. There had never been heat. But now there was no warmth of any kind, not even emotional. The room was cold in a way that reached past the skin, past the bone, all the way into the mind. Cold that spoke, cold that whispered without sound. Daniel no longer asked what the candle was. He knew now. It wasn't a thing, not in the way we define things. It was a point of connection, a tear, a threshold, a window through which something watched, something that had been waiting far longer than his lifetime to be seen again. It had studied him, it had learned him, and now it had begun to reveal itself. The shadows on the walls no longer obeyed natural laws. They reached in the wrong direction, pulled where there was no obstruction. Some even moved when nothing else did. He had watched one crawl along the baseboard like a slug of night. Another blinked, and he felt it behind his eyes. The symbols were everywhere now, carved, burned, etched in wax and dirt and dried blood. Some he had drawn, others he had no memory of. They came to him in waking dreams, in patterns formed by spiderwebs in corners, in the way the floorboards creaked as he walked, language without alphabet. language meant for other kinds of mouths. He had begun whispering them aloud, not knowing why, not knowing what they meant, only that the candle listened. Tonight, the storm was not just wind, it was a herald. The flame knew. It flickered violently as the first gust slammed against the house, bent to one side as if bowing to some invisible force. Daniel didn't flinch. He only watched. Something within him had quieted, gone still like prey that senses a predator's gaze. He knew this was the end, not death. Something else. The change began with sound, a low hum, like a tuning fork vibrating beneath the skin. It came from the candle, but not from the flame, from the space around it. The air shimmered, thickening. The flame grew taller, brighter. Then, without warning, it split down the middle into two identical vertical flares, mirrored, symmetrical. For the first time, Daniel heard something emerge, a voice, but not a voice, a presence that pressed itself into his mind like fingers through clay. There were no words, yet he understood. You have opened it. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth was dry, his jaw locked. He tried to move, but his limbs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The flame twisted. The wind outside screamed. Glass shattered somewhere upstairs, followed by a heavy thud, like something massive had landed on the roof. The walls groaned, the floorboards heaved, and then footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy, but not from the hallway, from beneath. Daniel's eyes widened. The basement. He had never opened the basement door. It was always locked, no key, just a handle that wouldn't turn no matter how he tried. But now it was open. He didn't remember opening it, but it stood ajar, yawning into blackness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, ascending. Something was coming up. The candle's flame reached the ceiling now, no longer dancing but waving, as if beckoning. The light turned blue, then violet, then a deep, bloody red. Shadows surged across the walls, writhing and twisting, forming shapes that made no sense. Shapes with too many limbs, too many joints bending the wrong way. The thing emerged from the basement. Daniel didn't look directly at it. He couldn't. He saw only the edges, angles that didn't belong in this reality, surfaces that shimmered and curled inward like a spiral with no center. It moved like a shadow, made of oil and stars, dragging behind it a silence so absolute it sucked the air from the room. The candle bowed toward it, and then Daniel spoke. But it wasn't his voice. It came from his mouth, yes, but the words were too old, too heavy. Each syllable burned in his throat, etched itself into his lungs. His body jerked with the force of the language like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. The thing stopped, listened, and responded. The flame folded in on itself, collapsing into a single point of white fire, so bright it cast no shadow, so cold it steamed the glass on the windows. The whisper returned, clearer now, and this time it had form. It emerged from the flame, not a person, not even a creature, a presence, shaped like fire, but made of something older. Wax dripped from its edges as it hovered above the table, eyeless and weightless, mouthless and speaking. Daniel wept, not from fear, from recognition. He remembered. This had happened before, not in his life, not even in his lineage, in memory itself, in the bone-deep record of a species that had once knelt before a flame and called it God, not for its warmth, but for its gate. The thing was speaking to him, through him, not just words, visions, He saw other candles, thousands, millions, each a doorway, each watched, some in homes, others in caves, others still in voids between stars, and behind every flame a watcher, each waiting for their eye to be opened, each waiting for Daniel to remember he was not chosen, he was bred. The candle had not found him, it had returned to him. The storm outside lifted the house from its foundations. The world inverted, walls split, time cracked, and through the split in the flame, Daniel saw into the other side. It was not hell nor heaven, it was before both, a realm of silence and shape and burning thought, a place of watchers crawling through time like termites in wood, waiting for cracks. Daniel's mind opened wider than it should have been allowed, and the thing stepped in. Not the creature, the flame itself. It entered him, not like possession, not like a demon in a book. It merged. He did not scream. His eyes turned silver, his veins blackened, his skin cooled, not dead, changed. His heartbeat stopped not because he died, but because he no longer needed blood. His breath ceased, not from suffocation, but because lungs were now irrelevant. He stood. The watcher behind him vanished, returning through the basement door, which sealed itself shut. The shadows receded, curling into the corners like obedient pets, and the candle, it flickered once more, just once, then extinguished. No smoke, no scent, just absence. The storm ended. The house, though half collapsed, stood in silence. The walls still wept in places. The floorboards were cracked, soaked in melted wax that hadn't come from the candle, and Daniel was gone. No trace, no blood, no body, no note, just a single empty jar with a cold, dead wick sitting in the center of the table. It stayed that way for days, weeks, until a house was found by a traveler, a man lost on the road, pulled into Wendlow by a wrong turn, guided by some strange curiosity. He stepped inside. Dust blanketed everything. He found the candle jar, picked it up, turned it over, empty. Then behind him, light, not warm, not comforting, just cold. He turned. The flame was burning again. He never left the house, not really. The cycle had begun anew, and elsewhere, beyond time, beyond form, Daniel stood in a place where flames burned without air, where thoughts screamed across the void, and where watchers turned their many heads toward a new eye. The candle had done its work. The gate was open, and now, on the other side, Daniel watched us.